When it comes to increasing yields and reducing inputs, potassium is the closest thing you can get to a guaranteed result. And we'll explain exactly what I mean by that today in this video, talking about how to manage potassium in a regenerative way. We're going over exactly how potassium is used in the plant, how it interacts in the soil, the fertiliser options, application rates if we need it, and then everything you need to know about using this in a regenerative system and being able to reduce all your potassium inputs except for maybe a few foliar applications. So in researching this, I came across some really interesting studies and concepts that I think would be able to almost completely reduce our potassium inputs. So unlike nitrogen and phosphorus, which we talked about in the other videos, potassium is one of those things where I think we could definitely almost completely reduce our inputs. So this is part of our Regenerative Nutrition Management series or course. You can find the course either on our YouTube channel in the playlist section for the Regenerative Nutrition Management series, or you can also find it on our website. There's also supplementary material on the website, so go check it out. So coming in right after nitrogen, potassium is the second most abundant mineral in the plant. Now, potassium is really quite interesting because it doesn't so much drive yield typically as what we typically understand it to be with the soil application. What it typically does is drive quality. And so when you think potassium, think quality and think resilience as well. Now, the main reason for that is potassium is required in what's called osmotic pressure. Now, this is the water pressure within the cell. So if you think of the cell like this, potassium is loaded into the cell and it increases think of it almost like the saltiness of the cell. Now the plant wants to balance out that saltiness with the outside of the cell, and so water will be driven into the cell to balance that out. That causes the cell to increase the pressure within, so inflating that cell. Now that's called cell turgor, which is simply how inflated that cell is. Now that's more or less pretty simple and one of the big components that potassium drives. It is what's called an osmolyte and drives this osmotic pressure. Now this is super important for everything else that potassium does in the plant. So when you think about osmotic pressure, all you got to think of is when the plant loads potassium into one area, water follows it. So the water will follow potassium to equalize or balance out the potassium concentration. So that's massive. Now this is important for a few functions. The biggest and most important is the movement of sugar within the plant, or sucrose. That's how it transports it. So this is called phloem loading. So say for example, the plant wants to move sugars from the leaf, so leaf photosynthesizing, and wants to transport that to either new growing leaves that aren't photosynthesizing yet, or developing fruit or grain, or the roots. Typically they're the main three areas, as well as other parts of the plant that need to maintain and grow. The plant needs to be able to move from the leaf to where it needs to go, so the grain. This is what's called the sink-source relationship, where you got the source, which produces the sugar, and then you got the sink, which is where that sugar is moving to. Now, potassium is required in the movement of the sugars from the source to the sink. The way the plant does this is this idea. So the plant will put potassium into the phloem. And now when you look into a plant stem, there's kind of two tubes. There's the xylem, which transports water from the roots up. So this is one directional, goes roots, water through the roots up into the leaves and then transpires out. So it's a constant flow of water going up. And then you've got the phloem. The phloem transports phloem food, and it can go up or down depending on the xylem loading. And so this refers to the plant putting potassium into a certain area within the phloem. So for example, the plant will load its potassium right here, right next to the source cells. So right next to the leaf. What happens is, it'll also load this sucrose or sugars into that section. And remember what we talked about here, where water follows that potassium. The water will come out of the xylem into this component and start loading the water into this spot. And so similar to an irrigation system, if you build up pressure on one side near the pump, that's going to force water to where there is less pressure. And so this water will effectively create a high pressure here, forcing everything to flow down to where it's low pressure, which is in our sink. So this will drive the sugars from the high source area into the low source area, like this. and then it gets loaded into the sink. So it's super important they understand that potassium is a significant driver of this process. And it's super important for you to understand this because it can influence so many other things within the plant, especially during grain or fruit fill. Now, in this book, Mineral Nutrition of Plants, it outlines that when you compare plants deficient in potassium and plants with sufficient potassium, the rate of translocation of our sugars or movement of our sugars is increased by 2 times. So what does that mean? It means that when the plant or the leaves produce sugars, there's it can increase that translocation by 2 times. Now, one study they found that sugars were able to pretty much be mostly transported within 90 minutes when plants had sufficient amount of potassium. But when they didn't have potassium, it took more than 4 hours to do that. So this is super important when it comes to filling up our grain with carbohydrates, which is where we get our grain fill from. Because effectively, if you can double the rate of which sugars go into the grain, that can really increase grain size. And that's massive, and that's what we'll be talking about in terms of increasing yield, and we'll talk about that towards the end. So that's really important. The other thing is that this process also drives cell expansion. So in expanding cells, that's quite important. And the other really important thing that potassium does is it regulates guard cells opening and closing. So you'll see what a guard cell is here. They are 2 cells on either side of the stomata, and they can open and close to allow for gas to flow in and out of the plant. And so what I mean by this is that you have your, say your leaf here, there's little holes in it. Those holes need to be regulated by the guard cells. Otherwise, if they're potassium deficient, what can happen is that those guard cells don't operate properly, which causes water to leak out of the guard cells, which is not good. You don't want your plant to be losing water because that will increase the amount of water it needs. So we really do need lots of potassium to make sure those guard cells work effectively so that we don't lose as much water. Now, the other thing is that we want these guard cells to work effectively so that gas, such as carbon dioxide, can then flow into the plant. Now, that's super important because carbon dioxide is required for photosynthesis. So potassium is almost in a way related to the photosynthetic ability of the plant by allowing for the carbon dioxide to flow into the plant leaves. So without potassium, the guard cells don't open and close effectively, leading to problems with the amount of carbon dioxide within the plant. So as I said, this is really important for ensuring that photosynthesis isn't limited by carbon dioxide. Now, there's 2 really important functions that we get from having potassium in the plant. The first one is drought resistance or drought tolerance. The reason for this is that potassium is required to create sufficient amounts of osmotic pressure greater than what's in the soil. And so during drought times, there's less and less water in the soil, obviously, which means the osmotic pressure, or the difference between what's in the soil and what's in the plant, becomes less and less and less. So we need more potassium in the roots for that water to have a sufficient gradient into the plant. Now, if that's too complicated, just know that potassium can increase the ability for the plant to suck in water from drier and drier soil. So that's super important. It helps maintain this xylem flow up into the plant, and likewise conserve water with correctly functioning guard cells. Now, on the other hand, potassium also helps with frost resistance or frost tolerance. The reason for that is that I would imagine 2. So there's the first one that increases photosynthesis or it prevents the reduction of photosynthesis from the guard cells operating efficiently, allowing carbon dioxide to go in. So that should increase the amount of sugars produced, which can then be transported around the plant because of this. Now, when you increase the amount of sugars and potassium in the plant sap, it creates almost like an antifreeze. And so the freezing point of the plant then can be reduced ever so slightly. This has an important implication for frost tolerance, as frost is effectively the freezing of the plant, and it requires almost like an anti-frost within the sap to prevent it from freezing. So potassium can help with that. It creates an anti-frost, anti-freeze effect, as well as the increase of sugars in the plant. So both of these things increases the plant's tolerance to frost. Now, this is very important to make sure you don't lose yield from, say, frost, affecting the grain set or pollination or whatever. So one really important thing, and we'll talk about this later, is that you can use potassium applications with a bit of sugar and carbohydrates, further apply that to your plants during times that might be frost susceptible, especially during those times when it's critical that they don't get frost, to increase its tolerance to frost. So they're super important. And the other part of the antifreeze part is that it maintains water pressure within the plant, which also reduces its freezing point. Now, potassium also have an effect on lignification, which is the development of lignin, which helps the plant stand upright. So that can reduce lodging in the plant. So potentially, if you have problems with lodging, it could be a potassium problem, but also could be a calcium or copper deficiency. So that really depends. The other really important thing that potassium has, or the role of potassium, is that it's required in protein synthesis, because the potassium is required in the ribosome, which is the thing that adds the amino acids together. It's required in the structure of the ribosome as well as the function of the ribosome. So if we don't have potassium, like a lot of the other minerals like magnesium, we don't get enough protein synthesis. Now, protein synthesis, as we know, is super important for reducing pest and disease attacks, because those pests and disease are seeking after available nitrogen sources. So for that reason, there's a lot of studies that support potassium applications with reducing pests and disease. So for example, rust is a really good one, a really good example. The application of potassium, especially as a foliar spray, or just making sure you have enough in the soil, can really reduce the severity and infection rate of rust in wheat. And so, as I said, there's heaps of literature on that, and you can find it all in Mineral Nutrition and Plant Diseases. There's, in the potassium section, there's whole tables on different pests and how they relate to potassium sufficiencies and deficiencies for different crops. So for example, rice, there's a significant decrease in blight as well as stem rot and brown spot. Likewise, things for rye, tomatoes, wheat, a lot on wheat actually, as well as everything from viral diseases, nematodes, and bacterial diseases. So it really covers a lot, and to sum it up, it's because of this protein synthesis component, as well as transporting sugars around the plant. And because of that reason, there's a interaction effect with nitrogen. So typically, the more nitrogen you apply, the more potassium is needed. Now finally, the potassium required in protein synthesis can easily be substituted out with sodium, which just completely wrecks the process. This process can really be affected by sodic soils where there's too much sodium in the plant, because it can replace the potassium, which then would increase the pest and disease pressure for the pests and diseases that potassium defends against. So you can see here, potassium is super important in the plant. Interestingly enough, it actually doesn't really form any structural part of the plant, apart from the structure of the ribosome. Typically, majority of the potassium in the plant is in the sap or the solution of the plant, and it just hangs out as a free ion. So now that we know that potassium is super important for everything, let's get into potassium in the soil. Now this is complicated, not as complicated as phosphorus, but it's somewhat complicated. So there's 4 main sources of potassium in the soil. There's the soluble potassium, where it's just it's potassium ions hanging out in the water solution, or the solution of the soil. There's exchangeable potassium, where the potassium is on the surface of the clay particles, weakly bonded to the negative sites on the clay. There's what's called, so that's the second one. The third one is non-exchangeable potassium. This is when the potassium gets lodged in between clay plates. So there's different types of clays. One type of clay is called a 2-to-1 clay. This type of clay, basically there's sheets of clay, and between those sheets, the potassium can fit in and get stuck potentially. So it's not super lost, but it is fixed, and it's more difficult for the plant to extract. And it's only on a few different types of clays. There's also 1-to-1 clays, which do not have this problem, but they also have a lower CEC, or cation exchange capacity. So typically the 2-to-1 clays are the best and can be a really good source of potassium. Then finally, there's mineral potassium. This is a potassium actually within primary minerals. These are minerals that formed from, say, volcanic activity. They are the rock, effectively. Now, there's two types of primary minerals that you can get potassium from, and that's K, potassium feldspars, and micas. These are the only two types of minerals that you can get potassium from. So the way this works is that you have your potassium in the minerals. This over time breaks down. This will break down, or these components will break down into clays. With that, will release potassium. Now, the potassium is also can be stuck within those clays. And so there's two areas that this can go into. It breaks down into these clays, and it has a potassium sandwiched between those two clay particles or the plates. It can also be released as the ion and then get attached onto the clay on the outside of the clay. So then it's exchangeable. So that's how they release into this component, to the exchangeable and non-exchangeable. And then the exchangeable has an equilibrium with the soil solution. So this potassium will then move in and out of the solution or soluble potassium as well as on the clay particle. And then the non-exchangeable and the exchangeable actually exchanges, which makes the non-exchangeable terminology a bit confusing. But this potassium can then replace this potassium. So they're kind of the four mineral sources of potassium. There's also potassium on the soil organic matter on the negative sides. Now, this is actually a really great source of potassium because it doesn't fix up as much. It doesn't really go into the non-exchangeable, so it's quite safe, which means a great way to improve your potassium storage is by increasing your soil organic matter, and that's super important on sandy soils. And the final source of potassium is in biomass or plant litter or animal residues or whatnot. This potassium then slowly decomposes and releases itself into the soil solution, and then it can either go into the exchangeable or non-exchangeable or onto the soil organic matter, or stay in the biomass as it breaks down. A lot of potassium is actually within litter or stubble, and we'll talk about the amount of potassium in stubble later. So when a plant takes up potassium, so this potassium here goes into biomass, and so we lose that outer solution. Now, the soil likes to maintain a certain amount of potassium in the solution. It's what's called equilibrium. It maintains a certain balance. So what happens is the potassium on the exchangeable sites in the clay, this one here, will then go to fill this gap there. So now this here is gone, and there's a gap there for the potassium here to then come out of the non-exchangeable and onto the exchangeable potassium, like that. So with this, you basically get a recharging from the non-exchangeable to your exchangeable to your soil to your soluble potassium, and then into your plant. Now the plant can also take it up directly from the exchangeable sites by exchanging a hydrogen for that. And then finally, when this is running low, the mineral potassium can then break down as well as and weather to then recharge this. So really, there's a lot of different sources of potassium in your soil, and not all of them will come up in a soil test. Your mineral potassium recharges your non-exchangeable and your exchangeable, and they recharge each other as well as the soil. Now this is very important, as we will talk about in the next component of the video. Super important to understand this, that there's actually a significant amount of potassium in the mineral component. So when we look at the amount of potassium we want on a soil test, also you can get a free soil test analysis on our website. I've made a free tool, so you can just enter in your soil results, the soil test results, and it'll actually spit back a beautifully made report that will tell you the desired ranges and found ranges, and then a nutritional recommendation at the end for balancing that. We'll talk about that in later, whether or not we actually do need to balance it. But just in terms of what's conventionally done, we'll go over that now. And so there's really four things we're looking at in a typical soil test, or the soil test that at least we use. So the first one is the exchangeable potassium. So that's the percent of potassium on the clay colloids, or the clay sites. So exchangeable potassium will depend on the amount of clay in your soil. Typically we're looking at, so if we write it down here, we're looking at somewhere between 3% for a very heavy clay soil, all the way to 8% in a sandy soil. So that's one way of looking at it, as a percent of the amount of potassium on your clay colloids, or that's exchangeable. The other thing that we look at is the amount of soluble potassium. The ideal level for this is anywhere between 50 for a sandy soil, and that's parts per million, all the way up to just over 100 parts per million on a heavy clay. Now, of course, the heavy clays are going to have more amount of potassium because it's from the mineral component that we get our clays. So the higher the clay content, we've got our clays here, the higher the potassium we're going to get. So it's expected that in a heavy clay, we're going to have more potassium. Now, on our exchangeable, in terms of parts per million, that's going to be anywhere between 100 for a sandy soil in parts per million, all the way up to 200 parts per million in a very heavy clay soil. That's exchangeable. Now, the other test we do is a total potassium test. Now, this sounds great, and it is really good because it considers soluble, exchangeable, non-exchangeable, as well as the micas. So it's a good test, but the big thing it doesn't consider is your potassium field spars. This makes up a lot of the amount of potassium in your soil. So on our totals, typically we're looking at, so total here, we're looking at anywhere between 200 parts per million, obviously in a bit more of a sandier soil, all the way up to 2,000 parts per million in a heavy clay. Now again, this only considers the non-exchangeable, exchangeable, some of the micas, and the soluble. What it doesn't consider is the K filter spars. And so in one study I found that the total amount of phosphorus, absolute total amounts, not just the total that we get done, which only considers the micas, but the total amount which considers the potassium field spars, ranges anywhere between 1,900 parts per million, all the way to 39,000 parts per million, with an average concentration of around 19,000 parts per million. So what does this mean? It means that there is so much potassium in the mineral component of the soil. The question is, how do we actually tap into that to access it? Because there's so much here that we could use this potassium forever. Now, for reference, 19,000 parts per million is roughly equal to 26 tons per hectare of straight potassium. And that's just in the top 10 centimeters. This would be enough to almost supply about 2,000 years of wheat harvest. And that's it. So there's so much potassium just in that top soil. Now, obviously, that's going to vary depending on your soil types and whether or not you have those K field spars with micas and the extent of weathering. But you can see there's actually so much potassium in the soil. It's just unlocking that. And I can show you how to do that in the next section of the video. So when it does come to looking at your soil tests, and it is saying you only need X amount of potassium in your soil, there's kind of two ways we can look at it. We can go, okay, that firstly is correct. There is only X amount of potassium that extraction could extract at that time, which is super fair enough. So we can look at it and go, okay, we might need to apply sun just to bring up crop requirements for the season. The other way we can look at it is our soil biology is not functioning enough in order to transfer that potassium down through the steps. So it's somewhat questionable whether or not the potassium on your soil tests are actually accurate, especially when you've got such a dynamic system of weathering. And now weathering happens in a conventional system very slowly, very much faster in a biologically active system, but it's very much dynamic between our non-exchangeable, exchangeable, and soluble. And so we'll talk about this later in the video. There's a few studies that they kept extracting, they put the same bit of soil through multiple potassium extraction techniques within a few minutes. And each time they're pulling off more and more potassium in the exchangeable. So the ability for the soil to recharge its potassium is quite significant. But if you do want to apply potassium and you see that your potassium's low and you need to increase it by a certain amount, I'll show you how to do that. So the typical way of doing potassium applications is with the maintain or build up and maintain method. So we talked about this a bit in the phosphorus management video, but basically there's two components. We want to build up the potassium reserves, and then we also want to maintain it with replacing the amount of potassium that we've taken off field. And so there's two components. We've got our build up, which is equal to the ideal level minus the current level. So for example, if we had the ideal level is 100 parts per million of potassium and our current level is 50, then we need to apply enough to make 50 parts per million in our soil. The easy way to convert this into kilos per hectare is you just times it by the bulk density times by the centimetres you've tested to divided by 10. But effectively, if you're just measuring to 10 centimetres, you just times it by the bulk density. So it's this times, you can roughly use 1.4. And that works out to be 70 kilos of potassium per hectare. So that's the build-up. So basically, you want to be making bits of potassium applications over a few years so that you build up what's currently in your soil to the ideal level. Now, this can be a little bit problematic because we'll load in potassium from here, in this section, as soluble, because a lot of the fertilizers are soluble. So it loads up here, and then everything readjusts to meet that equilibrium again. So if we load it up here, that's going to load into here. Some of that's going to load into our non-exchangeable. So it will increase the ideal levels, but just because you apply 50 parts per million doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be 50 parts per million increase on your exchangeable. Some of that will go into your non-exchangeable. But anyways, so that's the build-up, and then you want to do a maintain. So the maintain is using crop removal rates, which can be about 4 kilos per tonne for wheat. Estimate how much wheat you've taken off. So if we're targeting a 4 tonnes of wheat per hectare, then we want to apply 4 kilos for every tonne, so that's 16 kilos per hectare. So the formula for that is, I guess, our target times removal rate. So if it's our target's 4 tonnes, removal rate's 4 kilos per hectare, it's going to be 16 kilos per hectare of straight potassium. And then you add your maintenance rate to whatever your build-up rate is. So say you want to do this over 3 or 4 years, you might do 20 kilos per hectare of this, 16. You don't want to do too much because it can affect the uptake of calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus. So you just want to do it slowly over time and slow build up, rather than loading up a bunch of potassium into your soil. It can cause a lot of other problems. But so this is the typical way that a conventional system would manage potassium. And it's a good place to start, but as we've discussed here, we actually got so much potassium in our soil that we probably don't need to apply any. We just need to increase the weathering of the mineral component. So say we do have a deficiency of potassium and you do want to correct it using this. Here are the fertilizer options. So we have our inorganic fertilizers. Now all of these will contain potassium. The thing is, what are we also applying with our potassium that's going to, that we're also applying? And so that's the main consideration as well as cost. So the first one, calcium chloride. This is probably one of the worst options. It's cheap, but it's also nasty. This 52% potassium is quite high. It's also quite cheap, but you're applying chloride to your soil. Chloride is going to increase effectively the salinity. Chloride almost acts as an anti-nutrient. It is required by the plant, but only in very small amounts. So too much chloride will negatively affect your crop. This will prevent the uptake of phosphorus as well as nitrate, sulfur, any other ion. So it's not great. And we'll talk about this as well in the second half of the video when we talk about the potassium paradox. This is not great. Do not apply this as a foliar spray because the chloride will burn your leaves. Our favourite option is potassium sulfate. Now this is, I think it's a bit more expensive. Well, it's the more expensive one out of them. 49% potassium's not too bad, but you also supply phosphorus to it as well. So this is a great option. The problem with it is that it's low solubility in a foliar spray, so we can't apply as much as, say, some of the next ones. But in terms of the nutrients that we're supplying, this is the best one that would add and would recommend, even though it's more expensive, we're going to get a better result. Next is potassium nitrate. Remember from our nitrate video, nitrates stimulate vegetative growth and it can be quite expensive for the plant to convert that into amino acids. So this here will force vegetative growth that we probably do not want, as it will create a bit more of a struggling plant with a poor frame and structure. So this might be good if you're really wanting to push past your vegetative growth, but I probably wouldn't use this if you're trying to stimulate or use it during a reproductive stage, as this can be quite problematic. Likewise, 44% potassium, you can use it. I probably wouldn't. I'd stick with the potassium sulfate. Finally, we've got our potassium silicate. This is really good if you want to apply silicate to the plant. It can be quite problematic because it's highly alkaline, which means you can't quite apply it with any acid foliars as well because there'll be a compatibility issue. So this might be just a single pass. It can be problematic. You can do it. I'd probably use soft rock phosphate or some other way to increase silica levels. It's possible. So there are our inorganic ferts, and inorganic doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It's more important that we understand what we're applying, because potassium chloride, I would say, is quite bad, definitely as a foliar. But potassium sulfate isn't, and it can be quite beneficial. Likewise, you always apply these with fulvic acid. That can increase the uptake and the utilization of those foliars. Next, we have our organic sources. So fish. Fish is about 1.3% potassium, so it's not terrible. Like it's not as high as these, but you also get a whole range of other minerals. So fish, it's quite high in nitrogen, so I think it's about 5% or so. So you get those benefits as well as a carbon component as well as all the other minerals. So you can apply, I think there's a few fish hydrolysate foliar sprays that you can apply. Likewise, if you put a fish down with seeding as a liquid inject, that can be effectively a source of starter. Kelp's another good option. That's 1.4%, so slightly higher in terms of the potassium content than fish. You can also apply that as a foliar. There's a whole range of beneficial biostimulants and autoinducers and hormones that can stimulate the plant's development and growth, as well as microbial development. Finally, we've got manure. Manure is around anywhere between, I think it's 0.5 to 2% of potassium. It's a good source. If you're close to a manure source, so like chicken sheds or pig sheds or a feedlot, this can be a good source, especially if you want to kind of bulk up your potassium, as well as say phosphorus and nitrogen or other minerals. But as I said, these are really good. I think we can almost completely move away from soil applied potassium and just go for foliar options. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Finally, before we move on to actually managing potassium, let's talk about measuring it with a differential sap test analysis. So a differential sap test will measure the sap in the plant in the low and the mature and the nude leaves. So what this looks like, so we have our wheat plant like this. The plant will move potassium from the old leaves into the younger leaves, because it's more important that the younger leaves are optimized for photosynthesis, and so the plant will move the potassium, and since it's not in anything, it's just in the solution, it's super easy to move it. Typically what will happen is that the potassium will have almost like a burnt or burnt look to it. There's a bit of a orange, marginal orange triangle on the leaves. You'll see it here, but effectively that will develop in the oldest leaves first as that potassium is moving into the younger leaves. This is important to know because we can measure this using a differential sap test or differential tissue test. We like sap test a bit better. But we can see the concentration here and the concentration in our younger leaves and compare that to determine a deficiency. So for example, if you have, say, 5,000 parts per million in the young leaves and 4,000 parts per million in the young leaves, that suggests that potassium is moving from the old leaves into the young leaves and there might be an oncoming deficiency. So we can actually predict deficiencies before they happen using differential sap tests. Now we like to go on a 10%. So if there's a 10% variation between the young and old, that signals that a deficiency is coming on, and then we can determine whether or not we're going to get an economic yield response if we're going to apply a foliar. But kind of that 10% variation indicates to us that a deficiency is coming on. If you do have differential sap test data, you can actually use our free differential sap test tool on our website. to analyze those for you. We use this 10% variation rule rather than absolute values because the plant will tell us what it needs with that translocation. And so this applies to all species at all stages and it doesn't require any thresholds. So you basically put your SAP test data in and it'll spit out this custom report just for you with nutritional recommendations. And it'll come up with whether or not you have a slight, moderate or severe deficiency, likewise with excesses too. So that's a really powerful tool that we like to use, and it's very important for potassium because it's so mobile. We can really pick up deficiencies quite quickly. And then finally, we also use a Haney soil test for potassium as well. It doesn't tell you as much, but in terms of the extraction technique, it's really good because it uses organic acids similar to what the plant actually puts out. So it will tell you what the plant has available to it in the short term from potassium. So it's quite beneficial. Okay, now let's talk about how we can manage potassium in a regenerative way. So the first thing to understand is a research paper called Potassium Paradox, or the Potassium Paradox. And effectively what the researchers found was that with potassium soil testing, it's super inconsistent and changes from all the time. So really, they argue that the way we soil test potassium needs to change, and a lot of the times when you make a potassium application, it has no effect on yield. Now, I assume that a lot of the time they're talking about soil applications because there's more research, and we'll talk about it later, about foliar applications at the right time of potassium, and that has massive impacts on yield. So in terms of soil applications, I think that we could almost completely cut them out. So the first thing you'll see in the paper is this graph here. Now there's two things going on. First one is there's two measurements, one for field conditions, so with moisture, the other one in a dried singing pool. Now that's from fields where they had, I'm pretty sure, continuous corn with no fertilizer applications. And you can see potassium concentration firstly does this, so it varies so much within the season. Within season. But also it increases over time. So I guess the question is, how is that possible if you're removing so much? And it's because of this process. The other thing you'll see is that in this table, there's potassium. They do a potassium extraction. So there's the exchangeable potassium, they extract that. And then they measure non-exchangeable potassium. And they do 6 potassium extractions in a row. And they found that basically they extracted a lot, but then every single time afterwards, they still kept extracting more and more potassium. So that could suggest that the mineral potassium is then refilling this and it's weathering. So there's a recharge event. Now it's super interesting. You should go look at the paper, and there's lots of different examples. I think they studied over 2,000 field experiments on potassium, how it relates to yield and all that. But effectively, the main conclusion was that it's a big mystery, and the dynamics around this would suggest that there is a significant recharging event. With so much potassium in the mineral component, remember, there's about 19,000 parts per million of potassium all through the soil, that potentially we might not need to apply any potassium. The other thing is that they talked about with the application of potassium, especially soluble potassium. So you apply the soluble potassium, it solubilizes in the solution, and then what can happen is that it can actually lodge in between your clay particles. The problem with that is that there's two different types of 2-to-1 clay sheets. You got some with effectively a bit of water in it, and you got some without the water. What can happen is that the potassium can somehow displace that water and cause those clay sheets to then collapse on itself, reducing, what I understand, reducing the value of that clay. So I think that might potentially lock up potassium since you don't get as much of a swelling effect in these clays versus this clay because the water particles can't go in. So they talk about the collapsing of the clay with the application of potassium, which might lock up potassium even more from the application of potassium. So that's a risk. They suggest that instead of using potassium chloride, use potassium sulfate instead. It's a lot better. So in short, there's plenty of potassium in your soil. The thing is, we need to allow it to flow from the mineral component in the K field spars and the micas into non-exchangeable and then into exchangeable and into soluble. So how can we do that? So before we actually get into how we can cause that or induce that, let's talk about potassium removal rates. So every time you take a crop off the field, you're moving nutrients within that crop off the farm. Some crops remove less potassium than others. So specifically grains move less, or the actual fruit or the grain produced by the crop will remove less potassium. So you can see here, this is the removal rates of potassium per ton of that product removed. So for wheat grain, it's about 4 kilos of straight potassium for every ton we move. If we then bale up that straw of the wheat and send that off, we're removing 10 kilos of potassium per ton. That's a lot of potassium for effectively a very low value product. There's not much margin in removing straw, plus you're going to reduce your fallow efficiency, so conserve less water over summer. It's just, there is no point in taking off straw from your paddock. It's just, when you factor in loss of water conservation and the nutrient exported from that straw, it makes no sense. Likewise, you'll see in a lot of soil tests from hay paddocks that potassium is just, there is no potassium in it. The potassium removed in hay, and this is cereal hay, is about 15 kilos per ton. In loosened hay, it's about 20 to 30, so even more potassium is removed. And this makes a big argument for grazing on site. So every time you move product off farm, you're moving those nutrients. If we graze, for example, we're cycling those nutrients, and beef only moves 1.8 kilos per ton of the actual beef of potassium. So beef is a lot higher value than, say, hay. It makes more sense to graze on that paddock rather than cutting for hay. You're going to be losing less nutrients. But in short, it makes no sense to remove stubble. So keep your stubble on your paddock, and I would definitely suggest not cutting hay to then sell off farm. If you're going to cut hay, leave it to then feed your own livestock, because just the value in that potassium you're sending off farm probably doesn't even make it cut even. Now, if you're smart and you go, okay, well, during times where hay prices are very low, potentially we can use that as a strategy to import nutrients. So it wouldn't surprise me if that hay, when you factor in the nutrient cost, almost breaks even. So you could effectively consider your hay as a nutritional input to your farm while also feeding beef. So I think it's bringing in other people's hay. You got to factor in you're actually importing their nutrients, and you can effectively spread that around your paddock, especially if you set up like a bale grazing system or something like that on really poor areas, and can really stimulate a lot of soil development with that system. So now let's talk about how we can take this mineral potassium and get it into something that the plants can use. The very first one, it comes up all the time, is mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi doesn't only just do phosphorus, it also helps uptake of potassium. So there's a few really interesting papers there you can check out, but effectively it extends the root zone and helps plants take up potassium. I'm sure to some extent the mycorrhizal fungi can also release organic acids, which then dissolve the mineral potassium to then take it up. Next, now this is massive. Potassium solubilizing bacteria. These bacteria release organic acids to then solubilize the mineral potassium. So the mineral potassium here that's not available to the plant. The microbes can release this potassium to the plants. A lot of it is actually the K feldspars, which is massive. And so there's a interesting paper where they're looking at different potassium solubilizing bacteria, and this is what they found. They applied their potassium solubilizing bacteria and compared it to the baseline soil. So soluble potassium went up. So previously that 32, now went up to 50. That's pretty much the ideal level. Maybe a bit higher in higher clays, but now that's sufficient. That's great. Exchangeable went from 102 all the way up to 150. That's a 50% increase. That's massive. And then this is the really interesting part. Non-exchangeable went from 270 up to 494, so almost 500 parts per million. The question is, where does all this potassium come from? And it comes from that mineral potassium. So without even applying any potassium, we're taking it from the mineral component and getting it into the non-exchangeable, likewise with the exchangeable and soluble. The interesting thing here is that even our soil test wouldn't pick this up. The total soil test that we use, which uses a aqueous regata, I think, extractant, doesn't consider the K field spars, which means there's even more potassium in your soil than what the total soil tests that we use would detect. Now you can go the next step above and use hydrofluoric acid, which it costs so much more. I think more than $1,000 per test, whereas these ones are, I think it's just under 200. So it doesn't really make that much sense to get a mineral assay or the soil test that the miners get, because it doesn't mean that much. So we've landed on our soil tests just because they do provide the best information that we can actually use, minus, except for kind of potassium, which we know there's so much potassium in the soil that totals don't even really matter too much, because we're going to have enough. We can inoculate our soils with potassium solubilizing bacteria two ways. We can either do it with a soil primer, which we include that microbes or those microbes in a mix and spray it across our paddocks, or we can put on a seed coat on our actual crop or in a cover crop. That will then give our plants the biology to then break apart the mineral potassium into available potassium for our plants. So using this, our plants should never actually be potassium deficient. This should supply 100% of the plant's potassium requirements. Now, of course, if you have a very high removal rate, say for example, you're cutting a bunch of lucerne hay and you're moving 30 kilos of potassium per ton, then the potassium solubilizing bacteria might not be able to keep up with that. But if you're just running a grain operation, or even better, a beef operation, where you're not removing that much potassium, this will definitely 100% supply all the potassium you need. So this is in terms of increasing the soil potassium, or the available potassium to the crop, making sure they take it up through their roots. Now you could potentially just jump straight into this. Cut your potassium applications. Depending on your system, you might want to slowly step down, but if you're currently not doing any potassium applications, it might not even be a good idea to start. So getting mycorrhizal fungi on your seed treatments, and it's coating your microbes with it. Likewise, after a long fallow, definitely inoculating your seed, or after a brassica crop, mycorrhizal fungi, really important you do that, as well as potassium solubilizing bacteria. Now, one cheap source, or more or less cheap source, of potassium solubilizing bacteria, and it comes up all the time, is worm castings. So worm castings, they strike again. They have nitrogen fixing bacteria, they have phosphorus solubilizing bacteria, and they also have potassium solubilizing bacteria, as well as a whole bunch of other bacteria that would benefit your crop. So worm castings and worm casting extracts with mycorrhizal fungi would definitely be the best place to start, with making sure that microbes supply 100% of your potassium input. Now, we're big fans of actually making sure that the plant has what it needs. So we use a differential sap test for that, and it's the most accurate way to determine, does your plant have enough potassium? So we use a differential sap test throughout the season. If you're a low input wheat producer or raw acre, the single best return on your input money will be a differential sap test just after flowering, to inform a potassium application during grain fill. And so remember back to the previous whiteboard, potassium is required for the transportation of carbohydrates from the source, or the leaves, such as your flag leaf, into the head of the grain. So you need potassium for that movement of that carbohydrates from your leaf up to the grain. What we can do is foliar apply using a differential sap test, foliar apply potassium to increase the amount of potassium in the plant, to facilitate that and effectively double the rate of carbohydrates being moved into the grain. Now, a really important additional mineral that we need for potassium uptake and regulation is manganese. Manganese almost regulates potassium uptake. So typically, if you have too high potassium in your plant or too low potassium, it's due to a manganese deficiency. So it's super important that we apply manganese. Manganese tends to be quite high in our soils, but as we'll find out in the regenerative manganese management video, plants can only take it up in the reduced form, not the oxidized form. And a lot of our soils are oxidized, which means unless we really improve our soil health to reduce our soil environment, it's likely we'll have to be foliar applying manganese. But apply these two things together, and it will ensure that your potassium is right. So we would only apply a very small amount with a deficiency, so a slight deficiency, just enough to get it, because we don't want it to antagonise calcium for other critical stages of influence. But then definitely during grain fill. So we can use a differential sap test to confirm the deficiencies throughout the season, because we want to make sure we've got that drought resilience as well as that frost resilience, and then definitely during grain fill to load up that grain with carbohydrates. So if this sounds interesting to you, where we can actually influence the grain fill, you'd love our critical points of influence video, which talks about the 7 different spots in a crop's life cycle where a targeted foliar application can really drive quality and yield. Now, potassium is also a big driver of quality, especially in horticultural crops, because of that transportation of carbohydrates into the grain. And so you'll see here a bunch of different photos. We've got wheat, both in the grain from one plant, in a potassium deficient and potassium sufficient crop. We also got, so it increases the kernel weight, or the grain weight. It also increases the spike size and the number of grain on the spike, increases apple size. You can see that here. It's important for fiber, so in cotton, so that's very important, transporting the carbohydrates into the bowl. It's important for carrots as well as potatoes, so those carbohydrate storage organs on plants. Really, anywhere we're sending carbohydrates, we need potassium to do that. And we can, again, double the amount of carbohydrates moved by our plant with potassium. And it's also quite important in oil crops, so canola and sunflower, as well as peanuts. So really everything that requires carbohydrates to move from a source, so a leaf, into a sink organ, so grain or like a tuber, potassium is super important. So this here will probably be the biggest return on your investment as a farmer, just by a simple application of potassium. Now the combination of the mycorrhizal fungi, the potassium solubilizing bacteria, and a foliar application of potassium, just guided by your differential sap test, should do it for your potassium nutrition management. So using these 3 things, you should be able to cut out all other potassium applications, especially at the start of the season. Doesn't need that much potassium, and it can all come from the soil. So that alone should be able to reduce your input costs by cutting out majority of your potassium applications, redirecting some of that to a potassium application for grain or fruit fill, and then getting the rest from mycorrhizal fungi or potassium solubilizing bacteria. If you are worried about not having enough potassium, especially on those crops that require a high amount of potassium, what you can do is use 5% of your humic substances with your potassium application, and this will allow you to then reduce your potassium applications over time. So if you are worried, you can slowly step that back about 20% or so each year, until you get to a point where you're using a differential sap test to make sure you got enough potassium in your plant. Potassium is really good because it's easy to foliar apply. Now what the humic substances do is it soaks up that soluble potassium onto an organic substance. Remember, the soil organic matter can hold onto potassium, so does the humic substances. Makes for a great place to store that potassium, and it prevents it from then going into the non-exchangeable potassium, especially when you're loading a lot on. There's a good chance that that's going to get fixed up. So adding your humic substances to, or you can get like a humate granule, and you include that with your potassium chloride or your potassium sulfate, that will help prevent the lockup of those potassium. So that's a great way to then slowly reduce your application so that you can achieve this. Another thing we can do is basically include these, our mycorrhizal fungi and our potassium solubilizing bacteria, with our cover crops. That will firstly stimulate the microbial population to then effectively inoculate the soil for our next crop. Solubilizing bacteria, feeding it to our cover crop. We terminate that cover crop. There's potassium in that cover crop. That then lays down as litter, and that will then cycle for our following crop. So that's a really good strategy. And then finally, soil primers. So that's, again, you apply a liquid application across your paddock, and that will supply your potassium solubilizing bacteria. But the biggest return on investment will be putting effectively worm castings or your potassium soilizing bacteria onto a seed, and then that seed grows and then propagates or cultivates those microbes. Now, the other thing for potassium is that with its application, you can really reduce the uptake of calcium. And so there's a antagonistic effect between the two, and we need calcium in our plants for all other critical points of influence. So we don't really want to be applying that much potassium because it does prevent the uptake of calcium, which is super important. So we want to make sure we're just applying enough, and sometimes just the application of manganese can allow for that uptake in a sufficient range. But again, we can use differential sap tests to guide that application. So if this sounds really interesting to you and you want to implement these strategies as well as all the other strategies from our regenerative nutrition series and all our other regenerative practices, what you got to do is reach out to us. We have a free consultation that we actually go through about 30 minutes. I like to push it out to an hour, to be honest. And we can talk about ways that we can optimize your nutrition using a regenerative framework. And you can see here, this is very much founded in science, and we like to take a very low risk approach to these systems. So if that sounds interesting, sign up. There's a link below, or you can head to our website. Awesome, thanks again for watching. My name's Till, cheers.